I'm doing this series for people who have been in situations like me, people who are trying to figure out how to publish a book themselves while also being on a budget and not really being able to afford some of the more expensive services that come from writing a book. And one of those things that a lot of people have taken up is generative AI. So that's what I want to talk about today. How generative AI can serve as a tool to help us write our books. But I also want to talk about some of the consequences of using that generative AI. I have a little bit of conspiracy theorist in me. So when generative AI started to get really popular, I started to think about The Matrix. I started to think about Terminator. And I resolved not to be one of the people that made it a lot easier for Skynet to take over the world. I told myself I was not going to use any of the generative AI platforms because eventually it was going to lead to nobody having a job and just pretty much ruining all of our lives. And the more and more I told myself that, the more I started seeing people use it. It almost felt like I was in a competition with everybody else where they were all using steroids and I was trying to maintain some integrity. But if everybody is using steroids, I feel like it balances out. ChatGPT is kind of taking over the world. It's the modern Skynet. Unfortunately, I do kind of love it. I did want to fight the urge to lean into generative AI. Fortunately, ChatGPT is just a tool that you can use to tighten up your work. You don't have to be one of those people that tries to create 100% of your book through a generative AI form. Because ultimately, when you use these services, you realize where the technology is kind of lacking in that soul, or maybe not even the soul, but some of the brilliance that comes just from natural human error. Some of the best things that I find in stories come from some of the messiness that only a human brain can come up with. The generative AI services are great, but they are so refined that sometimes it just misses some of that flair. But I wanted to talk about editing, so I want to give you all a couple of the resources that you can use, the generative AI resources that you can use to help you edit your work. ChatGPT, great option. A lot of people use ChatGPT for a variety of things, but one of the features that I like a lot is if you convert your Microsoft Word document to a PDF and then you upload it to ChatGPT, it can actually analyze your work really quick, and that's very useful. Also, something like Grammarly. As I mentioned in my previous video, I did pay an editor at one point when I was putting out my first book, but even after that, I noticed there were still some things that needed to be fixed. I took each individual chapter and I posted them in Grammarly, and I used it to help me find all of the spelling and punctuation errors that had been left due to human error. And again, this is not any slight to my editor, but that is one of the things that these generative AI services are really good with. They can find those errors that humans just sometimes overlook. Also, there is a service called Writer, R-Y-T-R, that people can use to help them with their short stories. It can even give you some outlines for longer stories. There's another platform called Natural Reader. This is good for people who have already finished their work, but they need to hear it out loud. Something that a lot of people undervalue is actually listening to the words that you write. Sometimes if you're like me, you might want to squeeze a whole bunch of complex words and ideas into one sentence because you want to sound smarticle particle, and that's fine. But when you hear it out loud, you recognize this is too much. This is more than a mouthful. I need 7 breaths before I can even get done with this one sentence. Natural Reader is a great platform because it will let you hear your words out loud and make those ramblings that we all fall victim to sometimes a lot more clear to identify. And last, one of the services that I really love, Microsoft Editor. When you're in Microsoft Word, there is a feature called Editor that you can use that can literally track all of your punctuation, all of your spelling errors, and you can go in and find your score. Once you find your score, it'll give you a breakdown of some of the areas that you need to improve in order to make your writing a bit more clean, a bit more concise, and remove some of those errors that, again, we might be unaware of. It is right inside the Microsoft Word program. So if you're already paying for Microsoft, you already have a generative AI feature that comes with the program. I love the Microsoft Word editor, and even though it is a really great service, I have gotten into the habit of running my work through multiple services. I want a person to read it. I want Microsoft Word editor to check it. I'm going to run it through ChatGPT, and I'm going to run that through Grammarly. It might seem excessive, but one of my professors told me a long time ago, writing is rewriting. And what these generative AI services can do is they will all serve as a different editor for you. Some of the services will pick up things that others won't. For instance, ChatGPT isn't necessarily for creative writing, so some of the suggestions that it might give might not lean into the creative thought process. But this is why you also have your human editor. This is also why you use your Microsoft Word editor. You can also use Grammarly, where you can edit the type of tone or the type of style that you want your work to mirror, so it will give you your suggestions based on that. And the best thing about a lot of these services, especially like your Grammarly's and your Microsoft Word editors, they're free. Now, if you want the higher caliber features, you might have to pay a little bit. But if we're trying to make money, I'm going to have to spend a little bit too. Now, I gave a little information about the services. I want to talk specifically about the benefits. Generative AI is the best free writing partner anybody could have. If you're in a situation where you haven't really been able to find an editor that works for your financial situation, the paid version of ChatGPT is about $20 a month. That isn't super crazy, and honestly, if you don't have $20 a month, you probably shouldn't be paying to print books right now. Might not be the best idea, but c'est la vie. Generative AI can be used for those structural edits that we talked about in my previous video. It is also really good at copy editing. It is still a computer at the end of the day, so when we use certain colloquialisms or purposely use improper grammar because we're trying to feature an accent or something like that, it will try to correct those things, so be mindful of that. But it is really, really good at detecting just basic everyday errors that we all might make in writing too quickly, or we might be writing at 4 o'clock in the morning and our eyes done got blurry, so our periods are in the wrong place, our commas, our apostrophes instead. It'll help you out with that. Another benefit with generative AI, reading aloud, it'll help you hear those ramblings. I'm a person who struggles with that, so it's really important for me to hear my words out loud and realize that, oh man, I need a pause. Generative AI is really good at analyzing your work. Part of me actually hates that because it feels wrong to let a computer analyze something creative in that way. Because it almost feels like, again, we're programming the robots to take our place. But for right now, we got to do it, especially if you can't afford to have a real person critique you in that way. It is super important that we analyze our stories in totality. Sometimes we keep all of these ideas in our brains, and because of that, we think it all makes sense. We think it's all good. Every aspect is necessary, but those big picture edits, that structural editing that I mentioned in my previous video, is going to help you make your work a lot more concise and remove some of that filler, and it really improves your pacing. So you can use your generative AI to not only edit, but it will help you analyze and tweak the story in a way that makes it a little bit more neat. Also, in my opinion, the biggest reason why people use generative AI is to save time. Ultimately, nothing is going to scan through and read your work faster than a computer. It just processes things quicker than we do. If you want to be able to put things out under shorter deadlines, generative AI can really, really be useful for that. Now, this leads me to some of the consequences that come from using generative AI. One of the things that I don't like about it is it removes some of the communal aspects of writing. I personally feel like writing is a communal thing. Ultimately, we do write our stories individually unless we're working with a ghostwriter. And even when we use ghostwriters, the bulk of the work is still being done by a human person, which puts some money in that person's pocket and helps them to develop a skill. When we use generative AI, it's a little bit more difficult for us to develop those skills. And in some ways, it removes the necessity for particular jobs that other people are out there doing. So if all of us as writers decide to use generative AI for editing, a whole section of people end up losing their jobs. And I guess that gets into like a moral question. Is it wrong? Is it right? It's not necessarily our fault that they're out of work, because the expectation is we all are supposed to try to find skills that are necessary in the workforce. But we're also coming to a place where if we allow AI to take over so many different aspects of our lives, eventually there isn't going to be work for any of us to do. And that does feel wrong. Generative AI also lowers the barrier of entry. So I mentioned before, by using generative AI, it makes it a bit more difficult for you to develop your skills. Now, there's nothing wrong with people who are not super technically sound to write stories and put out their work. It's a great thing, actually, in my opinion. I don't care if people haven't reached a certain mastery stage, if they are still in the process of learning and developing skill and getting that feedback from the people that might support them, whoever those people might be when they release their work. But with generative AI, it allows people who have damn near no skill to plug in different ideas and receive decent enough work, and they begin to occupy space that people who have dedicated their lives to the craft and to the work of writing should be in. And that, to me, again, feels wrong. Not because they are owed that space, just because they dedicated their life and their time to it, so we should just give it to them. But if I'm putting in the requisite work for something and we allow the people who are juicing to take our spots, it removes the incentive to want to master anything. Why should I dedicate my time and put forth the effort to actually get good at something if somebody could just come along and use this generative AI robot to jump ahead of me? What is the point of even trying to be good at anything if ultimately we could just use AI to be good enough to be in those spaces? So in the beginning of this video, I talked a little bit about why it was kind of hard for me to accept using generative AI as a writer, especially as a young writer, because there's always this feeling like you have to do things a certain type of way or live up to a particular caliber. And you don't want to do anything that feels like you're not earning your stripes and doing it in a way that actually develops your skills so that the writers that you respect don't look at you like, oh, you're cheating. Generative AI for me just represents a form of progress. There's a writer named Yuval Noah Harari, and he wrote a book called Homo Deus. I really like it, but it kind of changed my perspective on how I felt about AI and some of the progress related to technology. One of the ideas that he talks about in the book is if there was some new form of technology that, let's say, for instance, North Korea started to use, and because they used it, their society really started to benefit. The United States is going to look at that technology, even if we don't necessarily agree with it, because we see one of our competitors benefiting from it in a way that makes us feel like they can potentially overtake us. The United States will eventually start using that technology. That's just a part of the progress because we want to keep a certain competitive edge. That's really no different than writers who want to be heard. There are more than enough pitfalls that come from trying to be a writer, especially if you're trying to be a writer that makes money. And while I think that everyone who is a writer, whether it's writing stories, short stories, poetry, songs, whatever it might be, should have an actual person review their words and look over their work, I also feel like where we are in time offers us technology that removes some of those barriers that would stop people who have really great ideas, really dynamic ideas. Generative AI offers tools and resources that sometimes price people out of the game, and you can't really beat that. So if you ever find yourself too rich with ideas and too broke for an editor, use the AI before Skynet comes.